The Barbarian. Chapter 1. Part 4. The barbarian's sleep was disturbed by the rays of the first sunlight, which had cut through the forest canopy and settled on his eyes. He squinted as he sat up, stretching his arms, and he rose to his feet. He looked around and saw the wicked details of his actions the night before. The drake's butchered corpse, and the pool of the dark green blood that came with it. The bones of his grisly meal were strewn about, and Kenny laid where the barbarian had left him. He grabbed his newly crafted crude backpack, and gently, yet with a barbarian's grim tenderness, arranged Kenny within the main pouch. His stiff form folded awkwardly, but he managed to position him with his horrid face peeking over the top, almost as if he were observing the world from the barbarian's shoulders. It was an unsettling sight, but he fit. With Kenny secured, he scanned the surroundings, his eyes furrowed as he searched the dense undergrowth for any hint of a path. The forest, still draped in the lingering shadows of early morning, seemed to close in around him. The barbarian began to walk as he pushed aside clinging vines and peered through thickets. He searched for any break in the unbroken green, any faint indentation in the damp earth that might suggest a passage. However, the wilderness remained untamed and trackless. No discernible trail revealed itself amidst the tangled roots and fallen leaves. The sounds of the awakening forest were the only sounds, and the way forward was as dauntingly wild as ever. As he walked, he remembered the locket from the drake's den. He pulled the cold iron locket from beneath his rough-hewn tunic. He turned the locket over and over in his hand, looking for any clue, any subtle imperfection that might reveal its secret. He tried to wedge the tip of his axe into a crevice, but the metal remained stubbornly sealed. Its rust-coated surface offered no purchase or method as to how it could be opened. The ancient object continued to hold its secrets tight, a silent enigma against the barbarian's efforts. Kenny, nestled in the crude backpack, remained as uncommunicative as ever, as his head bounced softly with every step. With the locket remaining stubbornly shut, he adjusted the weight of Kenny with a shrug and continued forward into the never-ending forest. After some time, the barbarian glanced over his shoulder at Kenny. "All right there, Kenny." His voice was a low rumble in the quiet forest. "Comfy enough in there, are you?" The goblin corpse said nothing as his beady eyes stared vacantly into the dense canopy above. He remained a silent, uncomplaining passenger, a macabre burden the barbarian had grown accustomed to. The faint, metallic cold of the locket against his chest, combined with the lingering musk of drake hide and the subtle, earthy aroma of the forest, filled the air as he continued his solitary trek. The barbarian pressed onward through the dense undergrowth as he searched intently for any indication of human presence. The forest seemed to shift and whisper around him, but then, amidst the tangle of roots and fallen leaves, the barbarian saw a subtle disruption in the wilderness. It was a faint path, barely more than a deer trail, but the saplings on either side were subtly bent, and the ground showed signs of being trodden by something heavier than woodland creatures. It was no grand road, but it was distinctly a path, and it led deeper into the woods, hinting at the possibility of a nearby settlement. Then, he smelled a faint wisp of wood smoke, almost imperceptible, drifting on the cool morning air from the direction of the trail. The barbarian adjusted the weight of Kenny in his backpack and followed the faint trail. The path was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for his sturdy frame. He pushed through low-hanging branches and stepped over gnarled roots as the scent of wood smoke grew stronger with each step. As he moved deeper into the forest, the dense canopy began to thin slightly, allowing shafts of the midday sun to pierce through and illuminated patches of the muddy, mossy ground. The trail, though subtle, was unmistakable now, and it clearly showed signs of recent passage. Ahead, the trees parted and revealed a small clearing. From within it, he heard the faint sounds of activity, the clang of metal on metal, gruff voices, and the unmistakable bleating of goats. It seemed the barbarian was approaching a settlement. He hastened his walk, and the winding trail led him out of the deep forest. The air became clearer, and the scent of pine needles gradually gave way to the faint smell of wood smoke, and something else. The undeniable tang of domestic animals. The sounds he had heard were louder now. Soon, the trees gave way entirely and opened into a small, unkempt clearing. What the barbarian saw was a rudimentary settlement, a little more than a cluster of rough-hewn log cabins and a few dilapidated sheds. A crude fence made of long sticks, woven together, had encircled a small patch of cultivated land, along with a pen, which held a handful of bleating sheep. A wisp of smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and a few figures moved about, clad in homespun tunics. This was no grand city, but a frontier outpost, a solitary bastion against the wilderness the barbarian had just traversed. A single weathered sign hung crookedly above what was the largest building in the settlement, though its faded lettering was unreadable from his distance. The barbarian turned to look over his shoulder at the slumped form of Kenny in his backpack. "Kenny, think we should go say hello? Introduce ourselves to these folk?" The goblin's head lolled slightly with the movement. His lifeless eyes stared unseeingly at the base of the barbarian's neck. There is, of course, no response. His expired features remained fixed in a rictus of silent observation, offering no counsel. The barbarian grinned excitedly at the prospect of human company as he continued his approach toward the small collection of cabins, the decision to engage with the inhabitants still his alone to make. The barbarian stepped through the break in the crude log fence, and his boots sank slightly into the muddy ground of the settlement. The sounds of activity were much louder now. The insistent bleating of sheep from a nearby pen, the rhythmic clang of a hammer against an anvil from a small, open smithy, and the low chatter of voices. A few grizzled figures, dressed in simple tunics and trousers, glanced up from their chores as the barbarian entered. Their expressions were wary, and their hands paused in their work as their eyes fell upon his imposing figure, and, more specifically, upon the grotesque, carved corpse of Kenny peeking from his backpack. The small, unreadable sign hanging over the largest building creaked gently in the breeze. The air was thick with a scent of wood smoke and the faint smell of animal pens. The barbarian squinted his eyes and focused intently on the faded script etched into the weathered wooden sign. After a moment, the obscured letters resolved themselves, revealing the words, "The Long Pine Inn." A low murmur rippled through the few villagers who had been watching him. Their gazes, initially fixed on Kenny, now shifted to his face, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes. The blacksmith, a burly man with a leather apron and soot-stained hands, stopped hammering as he stared at him with an unblinking intensity. The barbarian turned his attention towards the burly blacksmith. His face was rough, framed by a thick, graying beard, and his eyes, though narrowed, held a glint of something akin to assessment. Soot smudged his brow and forearms, and the air around him hummed faintly with the residual heat of his forge. "Howdy, partner," the barbarian grumbled, and his greeting hung awkwardly across the small clearing. "This Long Pine, then?" he added as he gestured vaguely towards the inn, then subtly towards the forest he had just emerged from. "Come a long way. Got some shit to sell and some questions to ask, if you've got a moment." The blacksmith's gaze flickered to the crude scimitars the barbarian carried in his crude backpack, then to the drake-hide coat he had fashioned. He reeked of death. Then he looked at Kenny's face for a moment, before he looked back at the barbarian. His expression remained unreadable. He wiped his hands on his leather apron, and the clang of tools at his side briefly broke the quiet. "Aye, this is the Long Pine," he finally said, his voice a low, rough rumble, like stones tumbling in a river. "And I'm Hopkins. What business might a man such as yourself have, emerging from the deep woods with that?" he asked, as he nodded subtly towards Kenny with a hint of unease in his eyes. "We don't get many folk like you round here. As for trade, I might. Depends on what you're offering and what you're needin'." He crossed his thick arms over his chest, waiting as his eyes still assessed the barbarian, trying to determine his intent. He unhooked one of the crude scimitars from his pack, and its dull blade reflected the dim light from the forge. "How much for this?" he asked, as he presented the weapon to Hopkins. "It's crude, but it'll still cut. Found it off a goblin." Hopkins took the scimitar, and his calloused hands turned it over. He examined the rough-hewn edge, the pitted iron, and the flimsy grip with a practiced eye. Finally, a faint frown creased his brow. "Aye, crude it is," he muttered, a hint of disdain in his voice. "And goblin made at that. Not much worth to it, but I suppose I can melt it down. 6 silver it is." He reached into a leather pouch at his side and counted out a few tarnished coins which he handed to the barbarian. His gaze remained excessively sharp, as if he was trying to piece together the story of a man who traveled with goblin weaponry and a carved corpse. The barbarian broke the train of thought. He reached for the other 2 crude scimitars, their rough edges a familiar sight. "I've got 2 more," he stated as he placed them on the table beside the first. "I'll sell both of them for 10 silver pieces." Hopkins picked them up one by one and gave each a quick, critical inspection. He nodded slowly, the frown on his brow easing slightly. "Aye, they're much the same. 10 silver for the pair. Seems fair enough for scrap metal." He counted out the coins and then pushed them across the dusty table. "That's your lot for the blades. Now what else brings you to Long Pine?" He gestured towards the inn again, and his gaze now carried a more direct invitation, though the wariness around Kenny remained evident. "I've been lost in the woods for 3 days. I'm looking for a bed for the night," the barbarian admitted. Hopkins grunted with a slight nod of understanding. 3 days in these woods, eh? Aye, that'll put a man through his paces. The Long Pine Inn, he said as he gestured with a calloused thumb towards the largest log building. "That's where you'll find a bed. Good ale, too, and a fire warm enough to thaw a winter storm." He paused as his eyes lingered for a moment on Kenny's decaying face. "Not much else here. Just a few trappers, some farmers, and those of us who live off the land. But it's honest folk, mostly. Just try not to scare the innkeeper with your traveling companion," he added, and the barbarian swore he heard a hint of dry humor in his voice, though his expression remained serious. "The woods ain't kind, and neither are some of the things that come out of 'em." "His name is Kenny," the barbarian blurted. Hopkins' brow furrowed slightly at the name. He glanced from Kenny to the barbarian, and back to Kenny again, and a barely perceptible twitch tug at the corner of his mouth. "Kenny," he repeated. The word sounded foreign and slightly absurd in his gruff voice. He then shook his head, as if dismissing an oddity. "Right. Well, Kenny, you'll find a roof over your head at the inn, and a warm fire. Don't cause any trouble for the barkeep. He's a nervous sort." And with that, he turned back to his anvil and picked up his hammer, signaling the end of the conversation and his return to work. The barbarian looked at the Long Pine Inn as he walked across the muddy road. He pushed open the creaking heavy oak door and went inside. The air was warm and thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, roasted meat, and spilled ale. A large stone hearth dominated one wall and cast a welcoming glow across the common room. Rough-hewn tables and benches were scattered about, some occupied by a few weathered trappers and farmers, as they nursed mugs of ale. The inn was active with conversation and laughter until they saw him. The sounds fell silent and echoed in the sudden quiet. Behind a sturdy, scarred wooden counter, there was a portly man with thinning gray hair and a nervous disposition. He stopped wiping a mug with a practiced flick of his wrist as his eyes widened. Everyone stared at the barbarian's imposing frame and Kenny's perished face, peeking from his pack. A weak, fake smile appeared across the portly man's face as he approached. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice strained. Come in. Find yourself a seat by the fire. Can I get you a drink, or perhaps a room for the night?" "Both," the barbarian ordered. The innkeeper nodded exaggeratedly, and a relieved smile spread across his face. "Ah, 2 things. Excellent. A room for the night will be 20 silver, traveler. That includes a mug of our finest ale. Can't have you sleeping thirsty, can we?" He gestured towards a stout wooden mug, then the stairs that led to the upper floor. To the barbarian, it was clear the barkeep simply wanted him to disappear to ease the other patrons. "Right then. The room's the third on the left, top of the stairs. Fire's going in the common room, and I'll bring that ale up to you shortly, along with some stew, if you've a mind for it." He rushed this information at the barbarian as he gave a friendly, still wary smile, and his eyes briefly flicked to Kenny, still peeking from the backpack. He then saw the stick that protruded out of Kenny's mouth along with the nasty, dark substance, and gave a look of abhorrent fear. Then he turned to fetch the barbarian's drink, praying to God he would begin to ascend the creaking stairs. The barbarian, however, did not. He sat down at an empty table and took a moment to survey the common room. The inn was simple but well kept, despite its frontier location. 3 rough-looking trappers sat at a table near the hearth, and they were engaged in a quiet conversation, occasionally glancing at the barbarian. Their faces were etched with the harshness of the wilderness. Another man, older and stout, nursed a tankard alone at a corner table, his gaze distant. The walls were adorned with a few faded tapestries depicting local wildlife and various hunting trophies. There was a mounted deer head and a collection of bear claws that hung from the ceiling beams. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows that played across the wooden surfaces. The overall impression was one of rustic, if slightly somber, comfort. The barbarian stood and approached the table where the 3 trappers sat, and their conversation immediately died as his shadow fell over them. They were a weathered lot, dressed in furs and rough-spun clothes, their faces tanned and creased from exposure to the elements. Each man wore a knife at his belt, and the scent of cured leather and wood smoke clung to them. Their eyes were sharp and assessing as they watched him walk up to them. One of the trappers, a man with a scarred cheek and a missing tooth, raised an eyebrow, a silent question in his stare. Another, younger and more nervous, fiddled with the rim of his tankard. The third was older and more stoic, and he merely watched him with an unblinking stare. "Evenin'," he said, his voice resonating in the sudden quiet of their corner. "Looks like you know these woods well. Any news round town?" The trappers exchanged quick knowing glances after his question. The man with the scarred cheek leaned back slightly, a wry grin stretching his lips. "News," he rasped. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The only news round here is the sheep disappearing at night. That the kind of news you're looking for, stranger?" The younger trapper shivered slightly, even by the fire. "Aye, old man Huxley's prize Wooly went missing from its pen 2 nights ago. Nobody saw what took it, but the ground was churned up something fierce." He looked nervously towards the door, as if he expected the unseen culprit to suddenly burst in. The oldest trapper just grunted and took a slow drink of his ale, his silence more telling than words. "Tell me more of this," the barbarian said inquisitively. The trapper with the scarred cheek stared at him for a moment. "We've seen tracks of a new sort of beast north of the pen. Big claws, thicker than a man's arm. The prints, massive things, deeper than a man's boot. And the way the brambles were torn, like a giant's hand had raked through them. I saw it myself. I say it's a new kind of bear. Others whisper of something older, something from the icy peaks to the north. Aye, that's the gist of it." He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "The smell, though, that's what really got us. Stank like a wet dog mixed with something sharp and foul. We've already started calling it the hellhound. Whatever it is, it ain't natural. We've told people to give that stretch of woods a wide berth since we saw those tracks." The scarred trapper fell silent, with a contemplative look of caution in his eyes. "How would you 3 like to hunt it with me and Kenny? Surely there's a reward for slaying this creature," the barbarian offered. The trappers exchanged glances, and the proposition hung in the air like the scent of wood smoke. The man with the scarred cheek let out a low chuckle, his eyes glancing from the barbarian to the grisly face of Kenny peeking from the backpack. "Hunt it," he repeated, a dry, rough sound. "With him?" He gestured vaguely towards Kenny. "And what kind of reward do you reckon there is for tackling something that tears sheep apart and smells like a troll's privy?" The younger trapper flinched slightly and tugged at his tunic. "That thing. It's not like anything I've ever tracked. And the Whisperwood has its own dangers. A reward's one thing, but getting out alive..." He trailed off and shook his head, his gaze fixed on the fire. The oldest trapper, however, lowered his mug slowly. His eyes were steady and assessing as he stared at the barbarian with a calculated look. "A reward," he murmured, and he let the words draw out. "The settlement elders might offer something for the pelt, or if it's truly as dangerous as you say, word of such a beast's death could be valuable. But it's a long shot, and a dangerous one. More dangerous than you might be thinking." He gave Kenny a perturbed look. "And bringing that cargo along?" He left the question hanging, the unspoken implication clear. The barbarian, impatient with the indecision, gave the ultimatum in a deranged, attempted form of intimidation. "Are you in, or are you out?" he said in a low, dangerous rumble that came off more as a threat than a question. He held the trappers with a hard, unblinking stare, and the casual banter died in their throats. The younger trapper visibly swallowed, his eyes wide, as his hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. The scarred trapper, though still holding his challenging gaze, finally broke first. A flicker of respect, or perhaps caution, entered his eyes. He slowly nodded. "All right, stranger, easy now," he muttered as he raised a hand placatingly. "No need for that. We'll talk. If it's coin you're after, fine. But be warned, stranger, this hellhound is truly dangerous, and, well, it's worth discussing, but we'll need to know the terms. And that thing on your back, it stays out of sight when we're around folk." The oldest trapper simply stared into his ale, but did not argue. His silence was a grudging agreement. "Well, it's too late for that," the barbarian said as he stuck a thumb back at Kenny. "Name your terms," he added. The scarred trapper leaned forward, his expression now one of business rather than apprehension. "Terms are simple," he began, tapping a thick finger on the table. "We go together. We hunt this beast together. Whatever bounty the settlement offers, or whatever we find on it, we split it 4 ways. 4 parts, equal shares. And that includes whatever you get from the pelt, or any other trophies." He paused and looked at the barbarian expectantly. "We know these woods, the paths, the signs. You've got the strength and whatever that is." He nodded towards Kenny again and continued. "But we've got the know-how for the tracking. It's a fair deal. You concur?" The other 2 trappers nodded in silent agreement, their eyes fixed on the barbarian, and waited for his decision. A low grin spread across his face. "Sounds like we're going hunting, boys." His voice was a satisfied tone, a stark contrast to his earlier growl. The scarred trapper grunted in approval with a look of respect in his eyes. "Good," he said as he extended a calloused hand, which the barbarian shook. "Name's Ronald. This here's Benton." He gestured to the younger, nervous trapper. "And that's Harold." He nodded towards the stoic elder. There was an awkward silence as the trappers waited for the barbarian to introduce himself before Ronald continued. "We'll meet you at first light, outside the inn. Bring your companion. We'll need every advantage we can get against this hellhound." Benton still looked a little uncertain, but Harold simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. The air in the inn, which had been tense, now felt charged with a different kind of energy, the shared anticipation of a perilous hunt. With the agreement struck, the trappers turned back to their drinks, but their eyes were now more animated as they discussed the coming dawn. The barbarian remembered the innkeeper's promise, and he turned his attention back to the counter. "My ale," he beckoned as his voice cut through the renewed murmur of conversation. The portly innkeeper, who had been serving another patron, turned with a start. "Oh, right away, traveler, right away." He scurried over with a large, frothing tankard in his hand. "Here you are, a fresh pour, just as promised." He placed the heavy mug on the counter with a clatter, and the amber liquid sloshed gently. "Enjoy your drink, and a good night's rest to you. We'll bring the stew up when it's ready." He then left to continue his duties, again hoping the barbarian would go upstairs and bring his cadaver companion with him. But the barbarian did not care to please the fat innkeeper. He sat and drank the first tankard, and the strong ale warmed his belly. With a satisfied sigh, he thumped the empty mug on the counter and signaled for another. The portly innkeeper, although annoyed the barbarian had not taken the hint, still filled a fresh tankard. "Another one, then. That'll be 2 silver, sir." He placed the coins on the counter, and the innkeeper swept them up with a practiced motion. The second ale was just as potent, its malty sweetness a balm after the bitterness of the first. The barbarian drank it slower this time, and savored the warmth that spread through his body. He felt the tension of the past days begin to ebb away. The muted conversations of the other patrons had picked up again, and the crackle of the fire blended into a comforting hum. The warm scent of the promised stew grew stronger and made his stomach rumble in anticipation. With the second tankard half empty, the barbarian let his gaze drift around the common room. The trappers, Ronald, Benton, and Harold, were still deep in conversation, their voices a low murmur and their faces lit by the dancing firelight. They occasionally glanced his way with a mix of curiosity and respect in their eyes. The older, stout man in the corner remained solitary and seemed lost in his own thoughts, his tankard untouched. Over by the hearth, a small, scruffy dog had curled up and twitched its nose occasionally at the scents wafting from the kitchen. The warmth of the fire, the aroma of cooking food, and the low hum of voices created a sense of rough, lived-in comfort. The barbarian saw this and realized the stark contrast to the unforgiving wilderness outside. He finished his second ale and nodded at the revelation as the comforting warmth settled deep within him. With a smile, the barbarian lifted the empty tankard and turned to the innkeeper, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Another one, barkeep," he called out. He made sure everyone heard and let his voice carry across the common room. "And one for my friend here, Kenny." He patted his pack, where Kenny's gruesome, shit-covered face peeked out. The plump innkeeper froze, his hand already mid-reach for a fresh mug. His eyes were already wide with a nervous energy, but now they practically bugged out of his skull as he stared at Kenny. Then back at the barbarian's face. A look of profound confusion and slight horror washed over him. The common room, which had been filled with low conversation, now fell silent. Even the scruffy dog by the fire lifted its head and cocked an ear. The trappers at their table exchanged disbelieving glances, and Ronald buried a chuckle in his hand. For your friend?" the innkeeper stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "But he doesn't seem to be, drinking much. Good, sir." He glanced nervously at the other patrons, then back at the barbarian. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. "Did I stutter?" the barbarian replied, and it carried a low, dangerous edge that seemed cut through the fat innkeeper's fumbling explanation. The sharp and demanding question hung in the air as all eyes fell on the innkeeper, who was visibly flinching, and his eyes darted across the room as if he were seeking an escape. "No, sir, you did not stutter," the innkeeper squeaked, and his face turned pale. He immediately grabbed a fresh tankard, and his hands trembled slightly as he filled it with ale. He set it down on the counter with a nervous clatter. "Right here, sir. For Kenny. Apologies. Just, not seen many folks order for their companions like that before." He forced a weak, strained smile. He was clearly eager to avoid any further confrontation and just wanted the barbarian to accept the drink and go upstairs already. The barbarian knew this and just smiled. "Thank you," he said to the innkeeper with a curt nod, and took the fresh tankard from his trembling hand. The ale inside sloshed gently with a rich, inviting amber. Everyone watched as the barbarian held it up to his backpack near Kenny's morbidly deceased face. "Here you go, old friend," he murmured, which held a strange tenderness in his voice, as if Kenny might actually drink it. The innkeeper watched, speechless, as he then slowly lowered the tankard and took a long, deliberate gulp himself. The other patrons remained quiet, their gazes fixed on the bizarre scene. The warmth of the ale spread through him, a satisfying heat that began to dull the lingering chill of the forest. The patrons of the inn seemed to sigh in relief, as they had begun to think they had misunderstood the barbarian's strange request. The innkeeper smiled, dabbing the sweat off his forehead with a rag, and was just about to turn back to his duties, until the barbarian lifted the ale again. He tilted the heavy tankard with the frothy ale near Kenny's perpetually open mouth. With a slow, deliberate movement, he poured the liquid. It dribbled down his stiff and waist-congested maw. It pooled slightly on his carved chest, before the ale finally soaked into Kenny's tattered tunic and the rough hide of the backpack. The damp fabric darkened where the ale soaked in, carrying the scent of malt and hops into the putrid stench around Kenny. A collective intake of breath was audible from the other patrons. The innkeeper, who watched with a mixture of apprehension and weary resignation, was visibly pale. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. Ronald, the scarred trapper, let out a short, sharp bark of laughter, but quickly stifled it as he saw the innkeeper's distress. Benton looked away and fixed his gaze intensely on the table. Harold merely shook his head slowly and had a faint, unreadable expression on his face. The quiet in the common room deepened, and the crackle of the fire suddenly seemed very loud. The barbarian wiped his hands on his trousers and turned his attention back to the innkeeper, who was staring at him with utter disbelief. "The stew?" he inquired, and the sweaty innkeeper tried to pretend nothing out of the ordinary had happened as he turned to retrieve the stew. The inn was silent, save for the footsteps of the chubby innkeeper, who quickly returned with a bowl of steaming stew. "Here we are, traveler," he said as he set the bowl down with a gentle thud. "A hearty stew, made with boar and root vegetables, freshly prepared." The stew was thick and bubbling, rich with savory herbs and chunks of tender meat. Steam rose from it, carrying a comforting scent that promised much-needed sustenance. The innkeeper glanced nervously at Kenny, then quickly retreated back to his counter, clearly eager to avoid further interaction regarding the dead goblin. The innkeeper had thought he was free from the barbarian's morbid amusement, until he heard him speak again. "And a bowl of that stew for my friend Kenny," the barbarian added, and gestured towards his backpack. The innkeeper's eyes widened again, his already pale face draining of even more color. He looked from the barbarian to the gruesome face of Kenny, then back to him, and his mouth opened and closed soundlessly for a moment. For Kenny?" he stammered again, and his voice was barely a whisper. He glanced around the room, acutely aware of the eyes on him. "But, sir, he's not exactly—" He trailed off, wringing his hands. "I don't think he'll be able to eat it." He looked desperately at the barbarian, hoping he would see the absurdity and retract the request. "I thought this was a respectable inn," he replied to the innkeeper with a smile. The innkeeper's face paled even further at the veiled challenge, and his nervous eyes darted around the quiet common room. "A respectable inn, sir? Of course a respectable inn," he babbled, and his voice rose slightly in pitch. He quickly snatched a fresh bowl from a stack, but his movements were jerky and hurried. "Right away, sir. One stew for Kenny. Coming right up." He scurried back to the kitchen as his back was stiff with apprehension. After a few long moments later, along with awkward clattering from the kitchen, he reappeared with a hot bowl of stew. His hand trembled as he set it down on the table beside the first bowl, and the rich aroma filled the air. He avoided looking directly at Kenny and kept his gaze fixed on the table, then to the ground as he quickly retreated to the safety of his counter, wiping his brow with a shaky hand. The other patrons continued to watch, some with open-mouthed astonishment, others with a mix of fear and morbid fascination. The oppressive silence was broken when the barbarian picked up his spoon and began to eat the stew. It was rich and flavorful, the boar meat tender, and the root vegetables soft. Each spoonful was a welcome warmth, a tangible return to the comforts of civilization after days of foraging and rough sustenance. The subtle taste of herbs and spices was a stark contrast to the bland wild meat the barbarian had been accustomed to. He ate with a hearty appetite and savored every mouthful. The inn's atmosphere, though still charged with the innkeeper's nervousness and the patron's quiet observation began to feel less like a spectacle and more like a simple, well-earned meal. Just when the patrons had thought the strange event was over, he scooped a hearty portion of the boar stew onto his spoon. "Here comes the airplane, Kenny," the barbarian bellowed, and his voice resonated with a strange, almost parental tone. He brought the spoon towards Kenny's gaping mouth. The stew spilled from the spoon as he guided it into the corpse's unmoving jaws, splattering onto his chin and dripping onto the drake etched on his chest. The barbarian took off the backpack and shoveled more spoonfuls of the stew down the dead goblin's gullet. The stew, now mixed with the dried remains of the barbarian's excrement, began to spill on the floor of the inn as the barbarian relentlessly fed Kenny more and more. "Shit, it's not going down again, Kenny," he hollered. He grabbed the stick in the goblin's throat and attempted to plunge the stew down with long, violent shoves and pulls. Kenny's vacant eyes stared at the ceiling, and his head jerked vigorously with the barbarian's movements. The innkeeper let out a strangled yelp and dropped the mug he was polishing with a loud clatter. His face recoiled, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and utter disbelief. "By the gods!" he gasped and stumbled back a step as his hand flew to his mouth. You can't do that!" he choked out with his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Get out! Get the fuck out of my inn, you crazy son of a bitch!" The trappers at the other table fell silent, and their faces were a mask of stunned revulsion. Ronald stared, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by a look of grim fascination, mixed with disgust. Benton looked like he might be sick, as he averted his eyes and pushed his own untouched bowl away. Harold simply watched, his weathered face unreadable, a silent witness to the barbarian's profoundly disturbing display. "But I paid for a bed tonight, innkeeper," the barbarian said calmly as he stared at the innkeeper. The innkeeper, trembling, pointed a shaky finger at him. "Paid! Paid, yes. But not for that." He gestured wildly at Kenny, his face splattered with stew as he stared at the ceiling. "This is a respectable establishment, sir. I cannot have such a display. You'll scare away all my patrons. I'll give you your coin back. Every last silver. Just go. Leave us in peace." His voice had risen to a frantic plea, with tears welling in his eyes. The other patrons watched silently, and some began to shuffle uncomfortably, eyeing the door. Ronald let out a low whistle, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Okay, innkeeper. Give me my coin back and I will leave. I humbly apologize for any wrongdoings I have committed," the barbarian said as he held back a smile. The humble apology and promise to leave seemed to calm the frantic innkeeper. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and his hand still trembled as he fumbled at his belt pouch. Yes, all your coin back. Just go quietly, please." He counted out the silver with shaky fingers and pushed the coins into the barbarian's hand. "There, 24 silver. Exactly what you paid, good sir. Now, if you just..." He gestured towards the door, his eyes wide and pleading. The other patrons remained silent, and their attention was fixed on the barbarian's departure, relieved that the bizarre spectacle was coming to an end. With the coin in hand, and his bizarre companion settled in his pack, he turned towards the door and left the shocked innkeeper in the quiet common room behind. He stepped back out into the crisp daylight. The sounds of the settlement, the bleating goats, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of voices were now muted as he put distance between himself and the long pine. The air outside was cool and clean and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The barbarian looked at Kenny and laughed. The stew was still dripping out of the corners of his mouth, and the stick was still protruding out. a little more so after the previous actions. He adjusted the crude backpack and ensured Kenny's lifeless face was still visible, a macabre beacon of the barbarian's unique journey. He started to walk until an idea came to him with a mischievous smile. He squatted down by the side of the path and scooped handfuls of cold mud. He looked at the mud in his hands for a moment and chuckled as he rubbed it vigorously onto his face and neck. The mud caked and smeared, poorly obscuring his features, and made the barbarian appear more like a creature of the wild than a man. Then he gathered dry, brittle strands of straw from the ground and wove them into his dark hair, letting them stick out at odd angles. The result he had hoped for was a crude disguise, but it just made him look like himself with mud on his face and straw in his hair. With his new, rougher appearance, he turned towards the Long Pine Inn and hoped the innkeeper would not recognize him. He pushed open the heavy wooden door once more and entered the common room. The familiar scent of wood smoke, ale, and cooking food greeted him. The few patrons who were present earlier were still here, and their conversations had resumed a normal cadence. The innkeeper was polishing mugs behind the counter when he looked up. He stared at the barbarian's muddy, straw-laden appearance, and a look of recognition fought with confusion. Suddenly, he threw the metal tankard to the ground with a crash. "No! You are not welcome here! Get out!" The portly innkeeper pointed at the door the barbarian had just entered. He stood there with mud in his hair and a smile on his face. "Are you deaf, monster? I said get the fuck out!" The innkeeper repeated himself and started throwing mugs at the barbarian. After the second mug was hurled at him, he pushed open the heavy oak door and left the inn as he stifled a laugh. The sounds of the settlement faded behind him as he re-entered the forest. The fresh, earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil filled his senses, a stark contrast to the close air of the inn. He glanced back at the sturdy log building and thought of the facade of normalcy, a thin veneer over the unsettling events that happened within. The villagers, the trappers, the innkeeper, they had likely returned to their routines, perhaps with a strange tale to tell of the muddy, straw-haired barbarian who treated a corpse to ale and stew. With a grunt, he adjusted the pack containing Kenny, the weight of familiar presence on his shoulders. The sun was still high, and the path north, towards the ridge and the rumored lair of the hellhound, beckoned. The wilderness surrounded him, indifferent to the oddities he carried. The barbarian reached up, his fingers raking through his hair, and pulled out the itchy strands of straw. He laughed as they fell to the forest floor, and thought about the innkeeper's furious reaction. Then he rubbed at his face, and the coarse mud flaked and smeared further before finally coming away, revealing his familiar features once more. The cool air against his clear skin was a welcome sensation. With the crude disguise shed, he felt the familiar presence of the wilderness settle around him again. The sun dappled through the canopy, illuminating the forest floor. Kenny's face now donned the dried stew and still peeked from the backpack, a silent, unwavering companion as the barbarian pulled out a substantial piece of the roasted drake meat. It was still somewhat tough, but the cooking had made it palatable, and the faint, musky scent was more appetizing now. He tore off a large chunk with his teeth and began to chew. The meat was gamey, with a unique, slightly reptilian flavor, which was not unpleasant. It filled his belly and replenished him after the strange encounters at the settlement. After his meal, the barbarian found a secluded spot amidst the trees, far enough from the settlement to avoid any lingering scrutiny, but close enough to make his way back in the morning. He settled down and the familiar rhythm of the wilderness lulled him into a deep slumber. The aches from fatigue from days of travel slowly seeped from his bones as the hours passed.